Welcome. Good afternoon, everyone. I hope you've been having a good convention so far. My name is Crispin Freeman, but you probably knew that. Welcome to this panel, which I was given this title. I did not come up with this title. The title, I believe, is Why We Love the Story So Much. And they said, that's your panel. And I said, okay. I'm okay with that. I assume most all of you here are familiar with some of my voice acting work, or familiar with the fact that I am a voice actor. Hopefully that's not confusing at this point. But you may or may not be familiar with my mythology scholarship, which I have a feeling is more what we're going to be talking about in this panel. So for those of you who are not familiar, I'm a bit of a mythology scholar. This is an area of study that I got into for my own artistic and personal enrichment. So I'll just give you a little backstory about that, and then I have a feeling that's going to spark conversation and questions that you might have. Because I like to just have a discussion with all of you. I'm not here to lecture. I'm here to have a dialogue with you about whatever topics you might be interested in. So just so you know why I got into mythology. When I was in graduate acting school, I had a sort of life crisis of sorts. This can happen when you're in a graduate artistic program, because whether you're acting or directing or painting or whatever it might be, graduate programs for art are very stressful. You don't sleep much. You're busting your tail trying to make things or create things or rehearse things. And it really is a bit of a crucible. It burns away all your excuses, all the dross, everything in the way, and it sort of gets you down to your core, what you really believe in, what you care about as an artist. And I realized that I didn't know. I had no idea why I was doing this on some deeper level. Certainly not on a level deep enough to sustain me for a career, right? Something other than just doing this as a dilettante. And so I had to figure out what I cared about. And at the depths of my confusion, where my art sucked and my personal life sucked and everything sucked, I was introduced to two things. One, I was reintroduced to my love of anime. Ever since I was a kid, I'd always loved animation, and I had a special spot in my heart for Japanese animation. It wasn't until high school, though, that I figured out that animation could come from other countries. You have to understand, this was back in the 80s, when, you know, we didn't have the interwebs. And so, me figuring out, oh, you mean all the stuff with the giant robots comes from another country? Well, that's cool, you know? But when I went off to college, which was the early 90s, the internet existed, but the World Wide Web did not. And I was a hacker. I mean, I was on Usenet and Veronica and Archie and all the different bulletin boards and whatnot. We still didn't have access to content. We didn't have access to media. And so I was completely disconnected from any television or film for like 4 years of college. When I got to graduate school, which was in New York City, there happened to be a store in the East Village called Anime Crash that sold anime on VHS tapes. And so I would go there and I would try to learn more about this anime thing that I loved as a kid, but now here's all this new stuff. At the same time that I was reintroducing myself to anime, I also discovered Joseph Campbell's work on comparative mythology. You may or may not be familiar with Joseph Campbell. He was a comparative mythology scholar who is probably most famous in most people's minds because he was a big influence on the original Star Wars trilogy. He was friends with George Lucas. Joseph Campbell said that George Lucas was his most attentive student ever. He was basically trying to absorb everything Campbell knew about storytelling and mythology and apply it to the original Star Wars trilogy. And so there's a wonderful PBS documentary series called The Power of Myth, which I believe is now on Netflix, which is great, so you can stream it on your iPhone. And it's a wonderful 6-part series where Bill Moyers goes to Skywalker Ranch and interviews Campbell about mythology. This was a revelation for me because Campbell acted as my Rosetta Stone. He was able to explain to my conscious mind why I was subconsciously attracted to these stories, why they were working me over, sort of low on the brainstem. And so once I figured that out, I was sort of off to the races because I wanted to learn as much as I could about mythology and comparative religions and see how they applied to pop culture storytelling. Because as cool as Joseph Campbell is, he didn't care for pop culture. Anything after James Joyce he thought was boring, right? So he just wasn't into it. So, I mean, he would wax poetic about Star Wars every once in a while because he was associated with it. But other than that, he didn't give a damn. He certainly didn't care about giant robots. I do. So much of my work is trying to understand the patterns in storytelling and the patterns that come out of this storytelling, even when the artist isn't even thinking about it. If you take a young American boy and a young Japanese boy, and you sit them down and you ask each of them to write a comic book, chances are the Japanese boy is going to write about giant robots, and the American boy is going to write about superheroes. They're not even thinking about it. That's just what's going to come out of them. And that's sort of where my fascination came from, is what are these larger patterns in storytelling that just keep coming up over and over again? Because chances are they're rooted in the religious and mythological traditions of a culture. And while I sometimes use mythology and religion interchangeably, they're not really interchangeable. At least the way that I define them. Other people might define them differently. But for me, mythology is the narrative aspect of a religion. So religions are complicated things, and they have rituals and sacred spaces and dogma and all this other stuff. Mythology is the narrative or the storytelling aspect of a religion. Of any religion, it is usually the mythology that lasts the longest. So we may not know exactly what they did at the Oracle at Delphi or how the rituals went or what they did, but we've got the stories. The stories stick around. And so those tend to influence a lot in terms of how we look at the world. So my mythology scholarship serves two purposes. The first, obviously, is an artistic one. By exploring the storytelling in different cultures, I'm hoping to broaden the buffet of artistic possibilities. Right? If you've only seen superhero storytelling and you've never seen anything else, you sort of get in a rut and you don't realize that there's different ways you could tell stories, or there's different possibilities of storytelling. So I like to broaden the buffet so that there's many options as possible from an artistic standpoint. I think it enriches everything. It makes a broader and more diverse ecosystem of storytelling. But the second purpose of my mythology scholarship, and I would argue probably the more important one, is personal. Is about self-development and self-actualization. It is my firm belief that we become the stories we tell ourselves. The stories that we repeat or absorb over and over again tend to manifest in our lives. So if you want to become the authority for your life, if you literally want to author your life, it behooves you to know what the possibilities of storytelling are, because then you can change the direction of your life in the way you might want it to go. So most of my mythology scholarship is sort of me raising the hood to show you how the engine works. And then you can look at the engine and decide whether you like it or you want to change it. You know, and I might raise it and go, yep, that's a Chevy V8, I like it, cool, I'm good. Right? And then you just know you need to change the oil and you make sure the spark plugs are clean, whatever. But you might open it up and go, no, I don't like a V8, I want a hybrid. Or I want a fuel cell, or a full electric, or actually I want to do an atomic car. You know, who knows? You can come up with, or some other thing, you know, but by understanding that, you can make conscious decisions about your artistry, not just knee-jerk reflexive decisions, and conscious decisions about the journey of your life, the story of your life. So that's sort of the overall agenda of my scholarship. But I'm happy to talk with any of you about storytelling, about questions you might have about storytelling, about artistry. One of the things is, when all of you dress up as the characters, Campbell would call this the reenacting of a myth. Campbell's definition of a ritual is the reenactment of a myth. By reenacting the story of the religion, you are trying to put yourself in alignment with the wisdom tradition of that system. So when people dress up as Jedi, they're trying, some part of their psyche is trying to absorb what they find appealing about the storytelling. And it may be just the character, you may just like the character. But for me, it's almost impossible to divorce character from plot, right? Because you can't have a character without it doing something, and you can't have something done unless there's a character doing it. So plot and character, while people like to separate them, it's actually a false dichotomy. You can't really have one without the other. And once you start actually getting into the plot, then you have to deal with the value system of the world you're playing in. You have to deal with what I like to call the cosmology. How does the universe of this story work? What are the value systems of this universe? And what are the heroes fighting for? And depending on that cosmology, whether it's biblical, or Buddhist, or Shinto, or secular, there's going to be different goals that the hero is fighting for, or struggling towards. So, hopefully that gets your minds percolating about things. I'm sorry we don't seem to have a microphone ready for questions, but I'm happy to take questions from the audience if there's any topic you want to talk about. You, sir, with the blue ears.
So when you're talking about like anything, like, what if you have an situation where like the stories that you've been told in your life kind of rhyme, but you don't see it or you don't realize it yet. Like, so is a story finds you or certain stories, certain things hit you early in life or hit you and resonate with you, but you don't see it yet. Like your life is actually changing because of that. So like, it's like, say you watch like, I don't know, say you watch like a really awesome like TV show when you're a kid, right? And that entire genre, like that entire culture kind of sticks with you later on, but drastically impacts your life later on. But you don't necessarily see that it changes your life later on. But you don't necessarily see it until later on. It's still in your future, right?
I'm looking for a question. Do you have a question?
So like what I'm saying is like so the story finds you rather than you finding the story. That's
Right. Sure. So he's basically saying what happens if you watch a story at a young age and it affects you subconsciously. You don't realize the kind of effect it's having on you until later on in life, where suddenly you find yourself manifesting aspects of that story. And then doesn't it feel like the story chose you rather than you choosing the story? That absolutely happens. My wife will joke that when I was young, there was a series that the BBC put out that was broadcast on PBS here in America. It was an adaptation of the Sherlock Holmes adventures with Jeremy Brett playing Sherlock Holmes on Granada Television. It's a really wonderful series, probably one of the most accurate depictions of Holmes on film. And I had watched that as a kid, and it was one of my favorite things. And then I forgot about it. Fast forward 20, 30 years, I'm with my wife, I tell her how much I love this show, they start selling it on DVD or whatever, and I'm like, hey, why don't we watch some of them? I think you'll find it really enjoyable. So my wife and I sit down, and as the show starts going and Jeremy Brett is playing Sherlock Holmes, the things he's doing, like his mannerisms, the way he talks, the way he behaves, is exactly how I behave. And literally, my wife is like moving away. She's like, do you realize how much you act like Jeremy Brett in real life? And I was like, I did not realize. And, oh my God, I totally do, right? So there was something about the Sherlock Holmes character archetype, because that's another thing, is usually our entry point into a story is we find a character, a type of character that we really resonate with. And so Sherlock Holmes was one for me, which is why I love Doctor Who so much, because he's basically a sci-fi Sherlock Holmes with a magic wand, you know, like, and so I was like, Doctor Who. That character appealed to me. There was some wisdom in his psyche that I wanted to incorporate into my own, and I didn't realize it until much later. I just knew I liked it as a kid, so that absolutely happened.
Did you get more than one though? Like I found myself.
Oh sure, Legolas was another one. Like, as soon as I saw Lord of the Rings, and I was like, blonde elf shooting a bow and arrow in the woods, I'm in.
I feel like I have multiple personality syndrome. Like each character, I take on the traits or the personality of certain characters I watch, and then I reproduce that. So either I can reproduce the voice, or I reproduce the emotions, or something comes through me of that character. It's like kind of weird. It's like you're capable. It's like a guy from Mortal Kombat. What's his name?
I'm sure it's brilliant, but yes, there are multiple. You can totally identify with multiple characters and get different things from them, and that can change over time. So when I was younger, I was all about Legolas, right? And I've reached an age now where I'm like, yeah, but he's sort of dumb, right? He's not a terribly thoughtful character. And I'm finding myself now identifying with Elrond more. I'm like the lore master who's hanging out in Rivendell. I'm like, yeah. I mean, especially, I don't like the live-action Hobbit movies. I think they're sort of a mess. But when Hugo Weaving shows up with that banded armor as Elrond, I'm like, I mean, this is the guy who fought at the last alliance of men and elves with, you know, Gil-galad and was his standard bearer. I mean, Elrond's tough, you know, he's a cool dude. So I was like, yeah, Elrond, bring it. So yeah, it can change over time too. right, another question. Let's go over here. Yes, sir.
This is more about your research into different mythologies. Something that's very pertinent to me is looking at queer coding within storytelling. And I've always theorized that queer coding is basically a defense mechanism against a society that looks down on queer people. I'm not sure how much that necessarily.
Sure. Can you just so I'm on the same page with you? Can you define queer coding for me?
Queer coding is when a story doesn't explicitly say a character is trans or gay or anything like that, but give them mannerisms or ideas that think of like Ursula from Little Mermaid is very coded as a drag queen.
Gotcha. And is that coding for the LGBTQ community or is it for the straight community?
That's kind of what I'm curious about, because I think about queer coding in general and how, like, is it a more recent phenomenon, or has this always sort of existed within mythologies and storytelling cultures?
Well, I guess it depends on whether the culture has a space for queer characters. Not that many cultures necessarily do. But sometimes you will get the characters that start breaking gender lines, and so there's a famous story from the Ramayana in Hinduism about Rama leaving to go on his journey, and everyone in the city so admires their hero that they all are following him and they won't leave him alone. And he finally gets to this river, and he sort of treats it as a boundary mark, and he turns around to the crowd and says, okay, all of you women and all of you men, you're wonderful, but go home. Because I'm going to go on my adventure, and you don't need to come with me. So all the men go home, and all the women go home, and all the people who are neither men nor women stay. Fascinating, right? And so Rama goes off on his adventures, comes back, and he sees these people still waiting at the river for him. And he goes, ah, you are blessed ones. You shall be called Hijra. And these are people who are queer. They're on this sort of trans spectrum. And so they have a space in the mythology, you know? And sometimes you get Mulans or Boudikas or, you know, different characters like that, either historically, legendarily, or mythologically. So it just depends on whether the culture has room for that. Or if you have Achilles agonizing over the death of Patroclus, and you go, were they not lovers? Right? And that is
more implied rather than said.
Right, but that's because Greek culture had room for those kinds of relationships between men, you know, and actually encouraged it. So it really depends on whether there's space for that in the culture. Let's go in the back here. You, sir, in the suit.
With the rise of interactive storytelling like Dungeons and Dragons and all the other tabletop RPGs, how do you think that's affecting like the modern storytelling perspective, and how do you think that's going to affect future generations and like modern mythologies of today?
Right, like how is role-playing going to affect these things?
Yeah.
Role-playing games affect the storytelling. Well, there's so much going on in that space, Critical Role and all these other shows that are now becoming popular, and I realize there's like a massive fan base for this kind of thing. It's not something I follow, so I don't know exactly what's going on. However, when Gary Gygax and all these guys were making Dungeons and Dragons back in the day, they were trying to make an interactive version of Lord of the Rings. And in fact, they bumped up against the Tolkien estate a number of times because they were coming into sort of trademark and licensing problems. That's why they are halflings in Dungeons and Dragons and not hobbits. Clearly they're hobbits, you know, but then we have to say halflings so Gary Gygax doesn't get sued by Tolkien's estate. And so usually what I think what's going to be interesting about that is that people get comfortable with a cosmology. So the thing about fantasy is that Tolkien basically single-handedly created the modern high fantasy genre. And everyone now has to deal with the shadow of Tolkien. I mean, even George R.R. Martin says we're all walking in the footsteps of Bilbo Baggins, which is why the main character in Game of Thrones is a short guy who drinks. Right? He's a drunk hobbit, basically, is what's going on. And so, and you could take, like, Lord of the Rings and Harry Potter and just line them up in a spreadsheet and see all the parallels in the character and story and everything else. So, when you're playing role-playing games, it tends to be fantasy. And so people are participating in this communal mythology. It's almost like a collective unconscious of fantasy that everyone is playing in. And so what may then happen is that people might explore different aspects of this, and that might morph into original creations. So someone doing a fan fiction of Twilight turns into 50 Shades of Grey, right? So that you may have people who then explore the boundaries of the map and sort of want to see what go beyond their edges. So we may get some new innovations like that. I don't know if there's as much role-playing games in other cosmologies like sci-fi. I mean, I know those games exist. I used to have GURPS, the generic universal role-playing system, where you could play cyberpunk and you could do Blade Runner if you wanted. I don't know if those genres of role-playing are as popular, and so, but there could be stuff there. So it's a way for people to explore narrative and storytelling in sort of an improv fashion. And then maybe out of that improv will be the seed of some new creation that somebody wants to go off and sort of craft into something that's not quite as improvisational, but is more manicured, right? Is more garden, if that makes sense. You start in the front. You're gonna have to speak up, my friend, because it's very loud next door.
Okay, this is just from a producer standpoint, somebody who's like gotten to work with this past year. Given what you've known, so I had like this story of mine that I had like these characters I wanted to, I knew exactly what I wanted because of the way they are. And I tried to go through that after, but then I got one of the agents on like the after appreciated me thinking of them, but the material couldn't wrap them in. What exactly does that mean? Even though like I have characters that I know like they're perfect for this.
Okay, so just to repeat what he was saying, and to make sure that I'm paraphrasing it correctly, you have an animation project that you're producing?
Yeah, that I was originally producing.
Okay.
And then I kind of started for a while, but I said, I'm going to go back and redo the story.
Okay, I'm just trying to keep this as simple as possible so we can include everybody. So you have an animation project that you're producing, you have a character in this project, and there's an actor you're thinking of that would be perfect for that character.
And I know it's perfect.
Good. So then you try to pursue that actor to see if they will work on your project. The actor you're trying to enlist for your project happens to be a member of the Actors Union. And there are certain rules that we as members of the Actors Union need to abide by, which is we need to work on projects that are union projects, would mean they're abiding by the union rules. And so that you're doing the new media contract. Right. So that's one of the contracts the union offers, especially for people who are more independent. Right, you're not Warner Brothers or Disney. They have a new media contract for people who are independent to try to make it easier for you to work with union talent. Now, you try to do this, but then when you pitch the show to this union actor,
It's not a one shot like short film.
okay, it's a short film. So you pitch the short film to the actor. Their agent said that the actor was not interested in your project.
Yeah, because the show couldn't grab it.
The material couldn't grab them. That means that they weren't interested, right? Okay. And so you're asking me, why weren't they interested?
Yeah, even though I know they're perfect.
Right. So you're asking me to read their mind.
And I was originally, but after that, it's just kind of said.
Look, you may think they're absolutely perfect for your show, and they very well might be, but that doesn't mean that they like it, right? They have to decide, because I have a feeling you don't have the biggest budget in the world, right? So the chances are you're not going to be able to pay them the rates that they are used to getting for the kind of work that they do in animation or video games, right, in bigger productions. So if you cannot lure them with a salary, there must be something else that must be appealing to them in order for them to take that pay cut. Okay? And usually the thing that needs to be appealing, if they're willing to take the pay cut, is it has to speak to them artistically. They have to look at this and say, okay, I'm not going to get paid very much, but it's so artistically satisfying. It will feed me as an artist. It'll allow me to explore part of my artistry that I've never done before. That has value to me. And so I'm willing to work on your project because I believe in your project, right? Your project interests me. I find it fascinating. I want to work on it. If this actor does not find your project interesting, you have to ask them. But chances are, hounding them is pointless. They either like it or they don't. And if they don't like it, you can't convince them to like it, right? I've got chocolate ice cream. I don't like chocolate ice cream. But you would. No, I don't. I don't like chocolate. I mean, what can you do, right? So That's a challenge. So maybe that actor is not the perfect actor for your project because they're not interested in your project. Wouldn't it be better to have an actor who's interested? Yeah. So you should pursue actors that are interested. Now, if you keep asking actor after actor after actor, and then none of them are interested, then you have to wonder whether your story needs some more work.
Yeah, exactly that point. It wasn't just not one actor, it was a couple more, and then I started thinking,
so maybe then your story isn't quite as interesting as you think it is. We can get blinders when we're creating our own project, and we think it's brilliant. But then when we show it to somebody else, they go, you know, there's a plot hole here, this character isn't motivated, I'm not quite sure what's understanding here, what are you trying to say, right? There is a rigor to making stories. It's not just whatever you want, right? That'd be like, I'm gonna play chess and I'm just gonna move the characters wherever I want. No, there is an end game in chess. And you can play chess many different ways. But if you just break the rules, chess loses its meaning. You know, and so most stories, not all, but most stories are trying to tell a story with the beginning, middle, and end. They're trying to impart some sort of message. You know, are you going to use the Force or not? Are you going to destroy the ring or not? Right? There's some sort of debate in the story. And so the characters are usually on either side of this debate, and these characters battle out these issues, and it hopefully holds together like an equation, like an argument, you know, like a good debate. And if it doesn't, if there are weak points in your story, it behooves you to either get better at storytelling, or to enlist somebody who is better than you at storytelling to say, hey, can you help me with my story? What's missing? What's wrong? Is there something wrong? Because good storytelling people can literally look at something like a plumber and go, yeah, tighten this one, no, you need a different piece here, okay, that'll work better. I mean, seriously, that's what it's like with all the best script doctors.
So my article was concerned, like, I'm probably just going to want to rewrite this entire thing.
Sure. Writing is rewriting. Any screenwriting person will tell you that. Writing is rewriting.
And I admittedly did not polish this required from it.
Bilbo's first name was Bingo. And Strider's first name in Lord of the Rings was Trotter. And he wasn't human. He was a hobbit who had wooden feet. Aren't we glad he rewrote that? Right? User in the school uniform. I assume it's school uniform. Yes, in the blue blazer, go for it.
Alright, okay, how did mythology help you with your role of Alucard?
How did mythology help me with my role of Alucard? What helped me with that is I've always had an appreciation for vampires, ever since I was a kid, because, let's be honest, they get to look pretty, dress in nice clothes, and bite women's necks. What is not to like? Right? When it was Halloween and everyone was dressing up like mummies and Frankenstein, I'm like, you crazy. I'm gonna bite the girls' necks, I'll see you later. And talking this ridiculous accent. You know, like, what are you talking about? So I've always liked vampires. And so when Alucard comes about, it is my understanding of the trope of the vampire and how the vampire has worked as the meaning of the vampire over time. Understanding what Bram Stoker was doing in the original book, and even before that, the Nosferatu, how he had been portrayed in Murnau's silent film, and how the vampire had modified over time, so that I could look at Hellsing and go, okay, what is Hiramu-san doing here? These are the parts of the vampire lore that he's sticking with, and these are the parts he's innovating on. Interesting, right? Good. Well, I get what he's doing. It's a sort of a Tarantino, thing with guns. But more importantly, one of the aspects of the vampire is always dealing with whatever is taboo sexuality at that moment. So when Bram Stoker was writing Dracula, he was inspired by the actor Edwin Booth. He probably had a crush on him, right? Which is why the first feeding in the original novel is homosexual. So you've got a couple of different things that for a Victorian audience are taboo. One, homosexuality. The second, that the vampire is coming from Eastern Europe, and there was a great fear among all these upstanding Protestants in England that there was all this bad poisoned blood from gypsies in the East that were going to come and spoil good standing English stock. right? So there's something threatening about breeding with these Eastern Europeans. So you've got different aspects that are threatening, and so there's a titillation that comes from going beyond the boundaries of acceptable sexuality. Well, that's not really an issue anymore, right? I mean, hopefully homosexuality is not a problem, and hopefully we've gotten rid of racism. But, hopefully. So you've got to find something else that pushes the boundaries. So when the first Hellsing series came out, we did it back in 2001, the thing that was sort of a little bit beyond the boundaries was BDSM. Let's have slave-master relationships, and let's have all this sort of titillating, you know, like, now everybody's doing it, you know? Like, we got 50 Shades of Grey, and we, you know, and so it doesn't, the original Hellsing doesn't quite push that boundaries now, what is it, you know, 17 years later, the way it did back in 2001. And so that's usually going to be the next thing, is what's going to push that. That's how the vampire evolves over time. So I'm looking at that and going, okay, I see what, you know, and so what do we got to, well, we got to dial up the Nazi. Okay, let's dial up the Nazi. That's all right. Yes, ma'am in the blonde, and then we'll do the front.
So I think it's interesting because especially in the cosplay community, a lot of people tend to cosplay the same exact characters. Like I'll meet someone that cosplays the same person as me, and then I find out they cosplay 5 other characters that are the exact same. So it's like, what tropes necessarily would go into that? And it's funny because sometimes like in their childhood you find similarities between that. So is it like something that impressions them as a child that you think would reflect that mindset, or I don't know.
Yeah. So why is it that people cosplay certain characters, and when you and another person cosplay the same character, you find out there's an entire roster of characters
like
that are
different
similar.
Series too. It's
Right.
like crazy.
Yeah. So here's the deal. Part of the deal about being a human being is that you get a universe inside of you. You have this vast potential that can manifest in a myriad of different ways. And then there's life, and there's society, and there's school. And you have to sort of narrow down the parts of you that you present to the world in order to not get beat up at school, right? You have to learn how to talk like the people around you, you have to learn how to follow certain rules, and blah, blah, blah. And so what happens is you develop what's called a persona, you know, like the mask that a great tragedian would wear on stage. So you develop your public persona. That is not you. That is a subset of you. That is a narrow aspect of you. Because if you had been raised in a different part of the country, or a different country altogether, you would probably behave differently, speak differently, right? You'd be a different type of person. But you still have the same galaxy inside of you, right? So what happens is we end up moving towards archetypes, types of characters that our society approves of, okay? And if we can't find one that we approve of, if say we're queer and we can't find an archetype that is readily acceptable by society, we struggle. We can't find our identity. We don't know where we fit, okay? I had that problem when I was growing up because I was not macho. Most of the male archetypes and role models that I was being shown were very macho. And I was like, that's not me. I'm not He-Man. Like, that's not my thing. Or I'm not G.I. Joe. That's not my thing. And then the elves show up and I go, I'm an elf. Thank you. Right? I finally have my archetype. And so that's something that I can identify with. Because it gives me a lens to see the world and a way to interact with it productively, so that I don't get beat up at school. If I came with pointy ears, I'd probably get beat up at school. But I also ran around with a 65-pound compound bow that nobody could pull back except me. And so, you'd have these big, I'm like, yeah, pull my bow back. You can't. See ya. But it gave me an anchor. It gave me something to hang on to, and then I could sort of enrich my psyche from there. But I had a home base. So when people find these archetypes that appeal to them, it's home base. It's something that appeals to them. And so if you look at Guardians of the Galaxy, you're like, oh, it's the Avengers in space, right? And that pattern is not always repeated so exactly in American storytelling, but it's really iterative in Japanese storytelling. so that you can basically look at Power Rangers all the way back to Himitsu Sentai Go Ranger back in, like, what was it, 76 when the first show came out. And we've had like 40 years of Sentai, of Power Rangers since then. And it's always the same formula.
Yeah.
It's always the hero, the rebel, the fat guy, the kid, and the girl. Every damn time, whether it's Voltron or Battle of the Planets or Voltus 5 or Combattler V or what, just over and over it's that pattern. And so then you sort of parse where you fit into that. And so if you always like to play the rebel, then you're going to play the rebel in all of those different iterations of that kind of storytelling.
But is it Power Rangers different than it is here in America? Just because of the fact that
It's Power Rangers gets adapted differently. But when you can literally, and I do a whole presentation on this. There's literally a chart where I can show all, like, the red ranger, the blue ranger, the green ranger, the yellow ranger, the pink ranger. Like, you can line them all up, and then if you put them up, you can literally make continents of rangers of the same color. Over 40 years of this, right? It doesn't really vary that much. Every once in a while they'll throw in a white ranger, a black ranger. But then they go away and they go back to the red ranger, the blue ranger, the red, you know, and it's like red only, blue only. Like these tropes happen over and over again because they're satisfying to our lizard brain. But they're satisfying to the people who were raised in that culture. Americans who are not raised in the sort of Asian mythology don't understand. Why is it always 5 characters? Why do they combine into a giant robot? I don't get it. But the Japanese are like, well, of course that's what they do. Don't they do that over here? And we're like, no, the X-Men don't combine. I don't know what to tell you. Like, it doesn't work that way. So it can be a different ball of wax. But when you see a character in American storytelling in superheroes that is like sacrificing themselves, literally getting crucified for everybody in the world, and then coming back from the dead, you're like, where have I seen this before? Right? It's just that trope is going to show up over and over and over again because it's programmed in us. It's way down low on the brainstem, and it takes a very conscious effort for an artist to subvert that. One of the people I don't usually talk about in my mythology presentations is Miyazaki. Because Miyazaki is a very conscious creator. He does not line up with the typical Japanese storytelling tropes. He often subverts them. He often sort of goes to Japanese culture. So that when you look at something like Princess Mononoke, us as Americans might look at Princess Mononoke and say, oh, what a Japanese story. Not to the Japanese. The main character is Emishi, which is based on the Ainu, which is a Caucasian group in northern Japan. That's why all the elders, when they banish him, all have beards. Because they're white. So the main character of this Japanese film is white, and he is fighting bad samurai. Do you understand like how subversive that is to the Japanese psyche, where the samurai have always been the heroes? But the samurai and Princess Mononoke are the bad guys. And then go even farther, you have Lady Eboshi, who's running Irontown. Her name literally means Lady Manhattan. She's literally a woman who has put on the man hat and says, things go my way. In ancient feudal Japan, like that's so subversive. So to Princess Mononoke, to the Japanese psyche, is really digging. It's really saying, I'm going to make you think of it differently, I'm going to make you think of it differently. But for us, we're like, oh, it just looks cool.
Wait. Sorry, you should stop crying right now. But so, what if you were someone who grew up watching Japanese shows when you were younger, so you understood that you watched Princess Mononoke?
But did you understand it when you watched Princess Mononoke?
The first one probably not, but the second time, gosh, yes. So it's like kind of interesting.
But did you understand that he was white? Prince Ashitaka?
Yeah.
Okay. Did you understand that that would be subversive to a Japanese culture?
Yeah, I did research on all that stuff.
Research, my friend. It's research. Because you did not grow up in that culture.
True.
Right?
Yeah.
You did not grow up in that culture. So that's why that's subversive, right? So those of us who are not steeped in that culture have to do research. We are tourists. And we come and go, wow, isn't this interesting? Whereas for someone who lived in that, it's earth-shaking. It's like the bedrock is getting shaken underneath. Right? Let's go over here. Oh no, actually, the lady first, and then we'll go there. Yes.
What's your favorite mythology if you have a favorite, and what's your favorite?
You know, I don't really have necessarily a favorite mythology. It's not like I like Thor better than Zoroaster or something. Like it doesn't. That's not how I function because I'm usually comparing things, and I'm just interested in the pieces that I like. And there's no one system of mythology or religion that doesn't have an Achilles heel somewhere, you know, where I go, yeah, this is like, I really like Buddhism, but there's parts of Buddhism that are like, I'm not sure I'm cool with that, right? So there's always something where there's like, I'm not sure that, I mean, any conceptual framework has its limits. But if there is a mythology that I grew up with that is sort of near and dear to my heart, because I was raised in a very secular household, all of my religious studies are like an anthropologist, sort of learning this as a stranger. If there is one that speaks near and dear to my heart, it is Middle-earth. So other people went to church, I was raised in Middle-earth. Like that's what I absorbed. And so I will often go back to Middle-earth as a sort of comfy nostalgia trip. Even though I do not agree with many of the tenets of Catholicism. And in fact, when I was young, I didn't even get the Catholic influences on Middle-earth. To me, Middle-earth looked Taoist, because you had the evil ring and you had the good rings, and if you destroy the evil ring, the good rings go away too. And I was like, oh, well, that's yin-yang, that's balance in the universe, you know. So to me, Middle-earth looked much more Celtic, much more pagan, and much more Taoist. And it wasn't until later that I realized every good character in Middle-earth is pro-life. You know, like just don't kill. Don't, you know, but Gollum's there and he's trying to kill, and the whole fate of the world, just don't kill Gollum, just don't do it, right? Like, it's a bad idea, you know? And so that was only later when I started doing research, and I was like, oh, that's fascinating. But I really appreciate the craft that Tolkien put in to taking his devout Catholicism and his deep appreciation of Anglo-Saxon mythology and wokenism, and finding a way to hybridize those two so effectively. Because he did it a lot better, in my opinion, and in his opinion, than C.S. Lewis, who just kind of threw everything in the pot. You know, Narnia is not very well tailored. Like, you've got Minotaurs and Santa Claus, and like, what? Like, it doesn't, huh? And that was one of Tolkien's criticism of C.S. Lewis, because they were friends. It was like, dude, your world's sloppy. You haven't actually thought this out, because he hadn't, right? C.S. Lewis would write one book and then be like, oh, maybe I'll write another, oh, maybe I'll write another. Meanwhile, Tolkien's like agonizing over Middle-earth for 20 years before he even writes one book. You know, his world is a lot more cohesive in that way. Also, Tolkien wasn't fond of Narnia because it's an allegory, not a metaphor. It's a one-to-one relationship. Aslan is Jesus. Full stop. Like, you can't interpret Aslan in any other way. You know, he's not Moses, he's not Zoroaster, he's not the Buddha, he is Jesus. And Tolkien thought that was a bit fascistic. Like, it was being didactic towards the reader, saying, you must interpret my story this way. And Tolkien was like, no, I don't want allegory, I want metaphor. So, people look at Lord of the Rings and they say, oh, it's a metaphor for World War II, right? The ring is the atomic bomb, and Sauron is the Nazis, and Saruman is the Soviets, and Tolkien was like, you get your head up your ass, and you're talking, you're like, that it doesn't parse, because if that was the case, then the ring never would have been destroyed, it just would have been shared amongst the allies. You know, like, it doesn't line up as a one-on-one allegory, but if you want to see it metaphorically that way, you can. You can also look at it in different ways. That's why it was so powerful when Lord of the Rings came out right after 9/11. Because people suddenly felt there was an evil force coming after us, and so this story spoke to them. Even though, again, Al-Qaeda and the Ring don't line up, like, that doesn't make any sense, but the emotions and the metaphor have a resonance. Does that make sense? I've got new hands. Yes, sir, in the red shirt.
In recent memories, we've had two movies that are known for pretty huge.
I'm sorry, it's very loud. Can you speak up a little for me?
Okay, so,
two movies that what?
Sorry, there are two movies that were known for subverting expectations. Star Wars, The Last Jedi, and Avengers.
And which?
And Avengers, the new Avengers.
The new Adventures movie? Avengers. Sorry, you have to speak up.
Yeah, I'm sorry. Like, I'm like way over here. And
I know, and I'm way over here, which is why I want you to speak up.
You can stand up too.
Oh, cool. Hi, everyone.
Hi.
Last Jedi and Infinity War is what you're talking about.
Yeah, those two movies are known for subverting expectations for the viewers.
Did Infinity War really subvert expectations?
For some, but I mean, I've been
People didn't know what Thanos did.
Yeah.
For anyone who wasn't familiar with the comics, maybe, but it seems like it seems a sort of logical progression of the Avengers films. It's not like suddenly the Avengers turn evil.
I mean, like, basically the question is, how do you know how to calculate risk on subverting expectations? Because The Last Jedi did subvert expectations. It was meant to mix results.
Sure, but that's because the story doesn't hold up. My problem with Last Jedi is not that it was subversive, it's that I don't believe the character motivations. I have a hard time, they had to break Luke Skywalker as a character in order to push him around, to make him do things in the plot that don't make sense to me. You're telling me that Luke, who is so angry that he chops his father's hand off, and then realizes what a bad move that is, then allows the Emperor to fry him with lightning, right? He takes amazing amounts of abuse by a Sith Lord, right? And will not fight back, refuses. He has nothing but compassion. And with his father, wants to save his father. And then suddenly, 10, 20 years later, he's threatened by one of his students so badly that he goes psycho? That's not Luke. I don't know who that is, but that doesn't make any sense. And that's like the crux of Kylo Ren's creation myth. And that's when I go, all right, I don't buy it. Like you broke the character. You had to mess the character up to do what you wanted because you wanted to do something different. I'm all for something different, but make it better, right? Improve on what's going on and don't break the characters. There is a way to make Luke Skywalker jaded, absolutely. The way they did it doesn't make sense, right? There's always another solution. So again, subversive is fine. I'm even cool with adaptation. Like for instance, Fellowship of the Ring, especially like the theatrical cut. The extended version is good. It's got some slow points, but the theatrical cut of Fellowship of the Ring is brilliant. You know, and I'm a huge Tolkien scholar, and they took the whole race from the Shire to Rivendell, which takes like a month or more, and they compressed it to like a couple of days. It's brilliant. Like a race to Rivendell. I'm like, nice adjustment. You know, like that's a totally brilliant adaptation to make it work on film. The only thing that's missing from the theatrical cut that's in the extended is Boromir being tempted by the ring multiple times, which is really nice because that's nice so that when Boromir finally goes over, you've seen him try to resist it like 3 or 4 times. Whereas in the theatrical cut, I think it only happens once when they're in Carothras going through the pass, and so you're like, oh, Boromir flipped pretty quick. But other than that, like these are niggles, right? Fellowship, really good. Two Towers and Return of the King, I have more issues, right? Because they take some more liberties that make, like, the Ents don't know their force is getting cut down. What? That doesn't make any sense, you know, like, that's not good, right? So I'm all for that, and I'm all for being subversive, but you gotta be smart. You gotta be good about it.
So with the way that The Last Jedi took these narrative decisions, would you say it kind of made sense in the Star Wars mythos?
No, it doesn't make sense. It doesn't make sense because you had to break characters to get that myth. Now let me get this straight. Holdo, the Laura Dern character, right? She's the Admiral. She has a plan to save everybody, but she refuses to tell anyone. If you were on a submarine that was underwater and you were running out of air, and you looked to your captain and said, do you have a plan? You just have to have faith. As Leia would say, you'd be like, screw you, mutiny. You would do exactly what Poe and the other characters did, right? And because they did that, they screwed up Holdo's plan. And so you go, Holdo should have told them what the plan was. And you say, okay, but we don't want that to happen in the story for whatever reason. Okay, well, there's a way to solve that. Have Holdo be worried that there's a spy on the ship. And if she tells the plan, it'll get back to the Empire and they're screwed. And so Holdo has to take somebody into her confidence to try to deal with this, right? Now I have sympathy for Holdo. As it is, she's an idiot. She is the worst commanding officer. I mean, it's just stupid. You have people who are literally going to, like, effectively on a submarine, they're gonna asphyxiate, and you're just telling them to believe. Screw you! I want to get out of here. And because she did that, they end up tipping off the Empire. The Empire does figure out their and then everyone dies. Completely irresponsible. So is Poe, by the way. He's a war criminal. But that's in the first part. In the first act, the bombers, total war criminal maneuver. He should have been court-martialed. I don't know why anyone has patience for him. He's a jackass. But at least I understand what he did in Acts 2 and 3 of the film. So this is a problem. Because you go, why would you do it? Again, you are breaking the characters to push them around to get the plot you want because I like it. Because let the past die. Write a better story, and I will. I will gladly let the past die if you will give me something new. If you will give me something new that works, rather than just thumbing your nose at the past. I don't like you, Dad. Oh, that's really compelling. That's basically all of Kylo Ren. I don't like you, Dad. Oh, you're real threatening, dude. Can I have Darth Vader back, please? Can I have Boba Fett back? Boba Fett's more threatening than you. All right, gentlemen in the back of the blue.
that I think's interesting about Star Wars in general, and I can't think of any other examples of this, is it's telling the stories, but at least in Clone Wars and Rebels, the stories that are happening in the next room over. It's not Darth Vader and Luke. It's something that's happening on some other planet, and it's kind of, it would normally be the second tier of characters, but they become the first tier, and they're more approachable because, well, they're just folks like us, you know.
Yeah, I mean, certainly relatability. I mean, for the most part, I liked Rogue One. It's got some issues. It starts to turn into a video game in the last act, you know, and there's some other stuff. But overall, I thought Rogue One was compelling. I thought there was some interesting stuff in there. And I've been watching Clone Wars because I hadn't for a while, and I've been moving through. And there's some interesting stuff in Clone Wars. But Anakin is a horrible chauvinistic mansplainer, and I just want him to shut the hell up and wait until Ahsoka just takes him out, because he is just, well, you shouldn't have done that, Ahsoka. You should break the rules the way I break them. Can't you read my mind? Why don't you just act like a man? Oh my God, can you kill me, please? Right? Anakin in Clone Wars is the biggest jerk. I'm like, oh. And the lessons they keep telling Ahsoka, which is basically shut up and be docile. I'm like, oh. So that's frustrating. But yeah, no, there's a possibility for that. You know, I need to watch more of Rebels. I like the reason why I like Rogue One is because they have to hew close to Episode 4, 5, and 6 in terms of the style. So they can't go off into 1, 2, and 3 and the other one, you know, like, and so it has more, it feels more authentic to me because they have to deal with that sort of Guns of Navarone. We've got to take out the base sort of World War II sensibility, which I find more compelling. So, and I need to watch more of Rebels. But the bits of it I have watched, I've liked. I'm like, okay, this is cool. But yeah, that's fun. I find Luke very relatable, but that's just me. All right, let's do Man in the Hat.
So my question is, so like when writing for like a short film, something 20 minutes or less, you don't really have the luxury of like being able to sympathize with the character as much. You don't have that time.
Really?
So I guess my question is, for like a short film, is there any like tips or like?
Have you ever seen The Man Who Planted Trees? It's a wonderful Canadian film about a widower who lives out in the nowhere, this horrible wasteland in France. But he's gone and he's taken a bunch of acorns, and he agonizes over getting just the perfect acorn because he knows how difficult the land is, and he'll plant these acorns, and over the course of 30 or 40 years, forests grow, and it revitalizes the entire world. And it is a heartbreaking, beautiful watercolor animated film. It's 20 minutes. It makes me want to cry. The Man Who Planted Trees. It's a Canadian film. It's gorgeous. And that's just the first thing that comes to mind. Never mind some of the Pixar shorts. Right?
But like, what do you think, like, what makes that work? Because it's such a short time. Like, what makes you...
It's not the length of the story that is compelling. You may know the artist Will Eisner, a very famous cartoonist. The Will Eisner Award is named after him. He once did a cartoon that is absolutely heartbreaking. It's only 2 panels. The first panel is the front of a pawn shop with an old woman walking into the pawn shop. The second panel, is the woman leaving with money in her hands, and on the front of the pawn shop is a sign that says, "Baby shoes for sale." Tell me that doesn't break your heart. Why does that appeal? Because we as social animals have, over time through evolution, learned to empathize with our fellow creatures because it serves us to be socially productive as a group. If we were wolves, we might not do that, or foxes, right? If we were loner animals, we might not function that way. But because we're simian, because we're social animals, we do this. We can have compassion and feeling for one of our same species, and hopefully for Klingons. You know, but and so because of that, if you put a person or a character in a situation that is difficult, our heart often goes out to them if we find that character sympathetic. If that character is villainous, meaning that they have broken the rules of society in ways that we find unjust or immoral, then we might enjoy the punishment. Because again, we're social animals, and we want to make sure that we have an innate notion of justice, the same way that chimpanzees do, and even dogs have a notion of justice, right, and how you interact. And so that the key to doing a short film and having people identify with it is making sure that your character is going through something that people can relate to. You're right that in 20 minutes you don't have time to build Middle Earth, right? But you could do a short little fantasy film where you don't have to establish the whole world, but you can do a fairy tale in 20 minutes and break something's heart, right? They go into the forest. Hopefully people know what forests are. It might not play in sub-Saharan Africa. You know, they may not have the same relationship to a forest that those of us who live in temperate climates do. And so that movie might not speak to them. For instance, I was working with DreamWorks, and they wanted me to come talk to their creators about mythology stuff. And this one woman was really cool, but her producer was she had hard eyes. She's like, show me the money. And so I came in and I was talking to her about dragons and everything, and I do a whole presentation on Knights and Dragons. And she said, okay, great, we've got How to Train Your Dragon. How do you make this film appeal to Chinese people? I said, you don't. Because in China, dragons are not evil. In Europe, dragons are evil. They are fire-breathing things that steal gold and virgins. They can't do anything with either of them, they just steal them. Right? They can't make use of them, they just hold on to them. We call them creeps, you know, and so dragons are evil. And the whole notion of How to Train Your Dragon is that we're going to see dragons not as evil, but as friends. But the Chinese start with the idea that dragons are beneficial. They're dangerous too, they're dynamic, they're these water creatures, so if you piss them off, they'll flood the town. But they're not inherently evil, they're just powerful forces of nature. And the Chinese emperor is a dragon, and dads want their Chinese sons to grow up to be dragons. So no, you're not going to make How to Train Your Dragon appeal to the Chinese. But guess what? You've got another film called Kung Fu Panda! Which is the most Chinese film on the planet. So why are you trying to make this European film Chinese when you've already got one? You know, can't we have different flavors of ice cream? Does chocolate have to taste like vanilla? What is wrong with you? Needless to say, I didn't get the joke. But that's okay, don't want to work with that person. So, I think we're almost out of time. Let's do, maybe, we'll do two more, okay? We'll call it quits. So you, sir.
In terms of anime you've worked on, what world or mythology in an anime has grabbed you the most and stuck with you?
Yeah, what world has grabbed me the most and stuck with me? Well, to be perfectly honest, the first show that grabbed me the most, and actually inspired me to become a voice actor because I wanted to work on it, was The Vision of Escaflowne. So that is still probably my favorite anime television series of all time. It's knights and dragons and all sorts of wonderful mythology, and it's very subversive in how it handles knights and dragons. It's like Vision of Escaflowne and Revolutionary Girl Utena. They're like really close. Those are ones that I appreciated as a fan. I did get to work on it too, which was cool. But the one that was nearest and dearest to my heart that I worked on extensively was Wolf's Rain. Because Wolf's Rain is like this deep Buddhist Hindu cosmology with this sort of pagan hero story of wolves trying to find paradise. And me and the director, Mary Elizabeth McGlynn, were just geeking out over this because we would get the episodes a little bit before we had to record, and so we would watch them and we'd call each other, we'd watch them the same night, and then call each other up on the phone and be like, oh my god, so in the next episode this is going to happen, oh my god, and she would actually consult with me because the notion is these wolves are searching for paradise, and in one episode it looks like one of the wolves has found what looks like paradise. In fact, it looks a lot like the biblical heaven, where the lamb and the lion lay down and everything is peaceful. And she said, can we call the paradise the wolves are looking for heaven? And I said, no, you can't, because heaven is a biblical notion, and this one episode shows this biblical heaven and that it's a false paradise. So we can't use that because the paradise that they are looking for, the wolves are looking for, is not biblical. It's more Hindu-Buddhist. And so we've got to use a different term. We have to either stick with paradise or something like that because heaven's not going to have the right connotation. And so we would have these discussions about how to make sure that the mythology and the cosmology of Wolf's Rain was consistent throughout the whole story. And the wonderful thing about Wolf's Rain is that it has an ending. You may have watched anime shows that have this wonderful premise. They start from this wonderful place, and by the end they just sort of peter out and they don't... The problem with that is a story doesn't have any meaning until it ends. When the story ends, that's when you know what it means. Until it ends, you don't quite know what the meaning is. Maybe Superman's a jerk. You don't know. So because Wolf's Rain actually has an ending, that's why it's so satisfying. Because you're like, okay, that's it. they're not going to be able to make a sequel to that. Like, I don't know where they're going, right? And they're sort of done. There was a gentleman way in the back, and I think we're going to have to wrap it up.
Yeah, this probably is not the best question, but you had been talking about Lord of the Rings, and I was wondering what you thought of the Hobbit film adaptation's approach to the source material.
Well, I just talked quite at length about how I like Fellowship so much as an adaptation.
Right, yeah, sorry.
Thank you.
Sorry.
I'm not fond of the Hobbit films because I think they try to extend the material too much. I have no problem with going to the Silmarillion and like putting, I mean, the first episode, the first Hobbit movie is really the legend of Thorin Oakenshield, which I'm cool with, right? I think it's great, but then who's Bilbo? Like, it doesn't become about Bilbo anymore. And I'm like, it's sort of about Bilbo. So I actually like the Rankin Bass animated version of The Hobbit way better. I think that the animated version of The Hobbit actually hews much closer to the original storyline and understands the journey of Bilbo better, even though it's only like 84 minutes long. I think it handles the story much better than the trilogy. Because when they're going down with the barrels and fighting orcs and it feels like a video game, you just lose me. And sandworms, if they have sandworms, they don't have to fight outside of the Lonely Mountain. They can just use the sandworm to dig in, get the gold, and leave. I don't get it. So, but anyway, thank you so much for letting me rant. I hope you all found that helpful and useful in some way. If you're interested about my mythology scholarship, I have a website called mythologyandmeaning.com. If you go to crispinfreeman.com, which is my name, if you go to crispinfreeman.com, there's a link, right? There's a link there for my voice acting podcast and for my mythology website. So if you want to find out more, there's a trailer there, there's descriptions of panels that I give, and there's even a mailing list to sign up for if I'm ever doing a presentation and you're interested in checking it out. Thank you again for coming to the panel. It's been great talking to you.